What if the child you sacrificed everything to raise became the very knife pressed against your throat, and the fortune that was supposed to be your legacy became the weapon he used to destroy you? Welcome back to your ultimate destination for gripping revenge stories, family betrayals, shocking betrayals, and emotional justice. Subscribe now and join a community and tell us where you're watching from. Turn on the notification bell for our next story. Are you ready to witness the ultimate payback? Let's get started. I am Mr. ZAHA, and I am 68 years old. I want you to sit with that for a moment. 68 years. 68 years of calloused hands, early mornings that bled into late nights, and a back that aches now in ways I never could have imagined when I was young and bulletproof and certain that hard work was its own reward. 68 years of believing that the greatest thing a man could leave behind wasn't money, wasn't property, wasn't a name carved into the side of a building, but a child. A good child. A child who carried your values in his chest like a second heartbeat. I believed that with everything I had. I was wrong. But let me start at the beginning, because this story, my story, deserves to be told from the roots, not from the moment the tree fell. I came to America in 1981 with $43 in my coat pocket, a secondhand suitcase held together with a leather belt, and a name that most people at the immigration counter in JFK Airport couldn't pronounce without squinting. I was 23 years old. I spoke English with an accent thick as river mud, and I had no family here, no connections, no safety net of any kind. What I had was a willingness to work that bordered on the obsessive and a quiet, unshakable belief that this country rewarded people who refused to quit. I worked construction for 11 years. I poured concrete in the New Jersey heat and laid foundations in the kind of cold that turns your fingers white. I saved every dollar I didn't need to survive. I ate rice and beans more nights than I can count. I shared a 2-bedroom apartment in Newark with 4 other men for 3 of those years, sleeping on a mattress on the floor, sending money home, and hoarding the rest like it was oxygen. In 1992, I bought my first small property, a rundown duplex in Trenton that most people would have laughed at. I fixed it with my own hands, rented both units, and used the income to buy another. Then another. By 2001, I owned 11 properties across New Jersey and Pennsylvania. By 2010, the portfolio had grown into something I once would have considered impossible. Commercial real estate, residential developments, a small construction company that employed 43 people at its peak. I was not flashy about it. I drove a modest car. I lived in the same house in Westfield, New Jersey, for 22 years. I wore the same style of clothes I had always worn, clean, simple, nothing that screamed for attention. Because I remembered where I came from, and I never wanted to become the kind of man who forgot. And through all of it, through every late payment, every contractor dispute, every market dip that made me lie awake staring at the ceiling, there was one constant that made everything feel worth it. Benjamin, my son. Benjamin ZAHA was born in 1988, 7 years after I arrived in this country. His mother, my wife Miriam, labored for 19 hours to bring him into the world, and when the nurse placed him in my arms, this tiny, red-faced, furious creature who screamed at the indignity of existence, I felt something restructure itself permanently inside my chest. I would have walked through fire for that boy. I would have given up every property, every dollar, every achievement without a second thought if it meant he would be safe and loved and whole. I gave him everything I hadn't had. Private school from 5th grade onward. A car on his 16th birthday. A college education at Penn State, fully paid, with a generous monthly allowance that I look back on now and realize was perhaps too generous. When he graduated with his business degree in 2010, I brought him into the company. I wanted him to learn it the way I had learned it, from the ground up, from the foundation. I wanted him to understand what it cost. He learned quickly, I'll give him that. Benjamin was sharp in the way that men who've never truly struggled can sometimes be sharp, with a confidence that verges on arrogance, a fluency with numbers and presentation, and the language of deals that impressed the people around him. He had my instincts without my hunger. He had my ambition without my humility. I told myself that was fine, that he would grow into it, that the hunger would come. In 2015, Benjamin met Laura. If there is one thing in this entire story that I am grateful for without reservation, without asterisk, without any shadow of complication, it is Laura. Laura Chun was the daughter of a restaurant owner from Philadelphia's Chinatown, a woman who had worked her way through Temple University on scholarships and sheer stubbornness, who became a pediatric nurse and spent her days caring for sick children with a gentleness that seemed to radiate from somewhere deep and genuine inside her. She was warm and grounded and funny in a quiet way, and when she looked at Benjamin, she looked at him the way a person looks at something they intend to take care of, with attention, with seriousness, with love that wasn't performance. I liked her the moment I met her. Miriam adored her. Even our old dog, Biscuit, who hated strangers, sat at Laura's feet within 10 minutes of her first visit to our home. They married in 2017. A beautiful ceremony in upstate New York. I danced at that wedding with tears running down my face, and I wasn't embarrassed about it for a single second. For a while, for a few years, things were good. The company was growing. Benjamin was managing more of the day-to-day operations, and I was beginning, slowly, to think about stepping back. Miriam had been diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's in 2018, and I wanted to be present for her in ways that running a business full-time made difficult. I wanted to take her to the places she had always wanted to see. I wanted to sit with her in the garden on slow afternoons and let the world move at her pace. So I began the process of restructuring my estate. I consulted with attorneys. I planned carefully. The company had done well, extraordinarily well, and the total value of my assets had climbed to just over $40 million. I wanted Benjamin to inherit the bulk of it, structured in a trust, with provisions that protected Laura, that set aside funds for any grandchildren, that ensured the employees who had given years to the company would be properly taken care of. I told Benjamin about the plan in detail. I sat across from him in my office, the same office I had worked in for 20 years, the walls lined with the photographs of buildings I had built, and I laid it all out for him. Every number, every provision, every intention behind every decision. He nodded. He smiled. He said, "Thank you, Dad. I won't let you down." And I believed him. I believed him the way you believe a floor you've walked on 1,000 times, without checking, without doubt, with the casual certainty of a man who has never had reason to look down. I never thought to check what was beneath it. If you've ever trusted someone completely and felt that trust turned to glass beneath your feet, drop a comment below, because what happened next nearly broke me in ways I'm still learning to name. It started with small things. The way Benjamin began coming to family dinners distracted, his phone face up on the table, his eyes sliding away from Laura mid-sentence. The way he started making decisions about the company without consulting me, not large decisions at first, just small reallocations, small adjustments, things that could be explained away as initiative. The way he stopped bringing Laura to events, explaining her absence with quick, dismissive phrases. "She's tired. She had a work thing. You know how she is." I noticed, but I told myself I was an old man reading shadows. Then, in the spring of 2023, Miriam passed. She went quietly, on a Tuesday morning in April, in the bedroom we had shared for 31 years, with my hand in hers and the sound of birds outside the window she had always loved. She was 66 years old. She had faced her illness with more grace than I could have imagined, and she left a hole in my life so enormous that I spent the first weeks afterwards simply standing in rooms, forgetting why I had entered them. I was grieving. I was vulnerable. I was 67 years old and alone for the first time in my adult life. And Benjamin, my son, my blood, the boy I had built my life around, had been watching, waiting. He had been planning. I just didn't know it yet. The first thing Benjamin did, 3 weeks after we buried his mother, was change the locks on Laura's house. Not their house. Not the marital home they had shared for 6 years in Summit, New Jersey. The beautiful colonial with the wraparound porch that I had helped them purchase, that Laura had filled with warmth and plants and the smell of good cooking on Sunday afternoons. He changed the locks while Laura was at work. While she was at the hospital, in her scrubs, holding the hands of sick children and making the world a gentler place. Her husband was at home, packing her belongings into black garbage bags and stacking them on the front porch like they were refuse. I didn't find out from Benjamin. I found out from Laura herself, who called me on a Wednesday evening, her voice so carefully controlled that the control itself told me everything. She was calling from her car. She had come home from a 12-hour shift to find her key no longer worked, her bags on the porch, and a single envelope taped to the front door containing a letter from Benjamin's attorney. He was filing for divorce. The letter cited irreconcilable differences. It was cold and clean and surgical, written in the bloodless language that lawyers use when they want cruelty to look like paperwork. There was no warning, no conversation, no attempt at counseling, at compromise, at the basic decency of a face-to-face explanation. 7 years together, 6 years of marriage, and he had communicated the end of it through an envelope taped to a door. "Mr. ZAHA," Laura said, and her voice cracked on my name, just slightly, just enough to tell me that the control was costing her everything. "I'm so sorry to bother you. I know you're still grieving. I didn't know who else to call." I gripped the phone so hard my knuckles ached. "You never bother me," I said. "Where are you right now?" She was in the parking lot of a CVS 2 blocks from the house, sitting in her car in her scrubs with her garbage bags in the trunk, not knowing where to go. This woman, this kind, hard-working, decent woman who had loved my son faithfully and well, was sitting alone in a parking lot at 9 in the evening because my son had decided that his new fortune made the rules of basic human decency optional. Because that was when I learned the second thing. I called Benjamin that same night. He answered on the third ring, and there was something in his voice that I hadn't heard before, a smoothness, a kind of rehearsed calm, as though he had been expecting this call and had prepared for it the way you prepare for a business negotiation. "Dad," he said, "I was going to call you. Laura is sitting in a parking lot," I said, "in her car, with her things in garbage bags." A pause. Then, "Laura and I have been unhappy for a long time. This isn't something that happened overnight. You didn't tell me that. You've never said one word to me about being unhappy. There are things about my marriage that I didn't share with you, Dad. That's normal." I stood in my kitchen, the kitchen where Miriam had cooked 10,000 meals, where we had sat together as a family for 30 years, and I felt something cold move through me. Not just anger, something more like recognition. The first flicker of understanding that the person on the other end of this phone was not entirely the person I thought I knew. "Benjamin," I said carefully, "what is going on?" Another pause. Longer this time. "I've met someone," he said. "Her name is Vanessa. It's been going on for about a year. I'm not going to apologize for it, Dad. I'm not going to pretend to be something I'm not." A year. While his mother was dying in stages, while I was learning to navigate grief for the first time in my life, while Laura was working her night shifts and coming home to cook dinner and love my son with everything she had, he had been with someone else for a year, building a parallel life, and he had not had the courage or the decency to tell any of us. I told Laura she could stay in one of my rental properties, a clean, comfortable apartment in Westfield that was sitting vacant. She protested. I insisted. I was not going to allow my daughter-in-law, because that is what she was, that is what she would always be in my heart, regardless of what papers Benjamin filed, to sleep in her car or impose on friends because my son had lost his moral compass. She moved in the following day. I helped her carry the garbage bags inside, and when she stood in the middle of the empty apartment and finally let herself cry, I stood there with her, because there was nothing else I could offer except presence, and sometimes presence is the only honest thing. What I didn't fully understand yet was that Benjamin's behavior toward Laura was not simply the cruelty of a man intoxicated by a new relationship. It was calculated, it was strategic, and it was only the opening move in something much larger and much darker. I began to understand this about 2 weeks later, when I received a visit from my attorney, Gerald Morse, a man I had worked with for over 20 years, steady and unflappable in the way that good lawyers tend to be. He came to my house on a Friday afternoon with a folder under his arm and an expression that told me before he opened his mouth that what he was carrying was not good news. He sat across from me at the kitchen table and laid out the folder carefully, the way a doctor lays out test results he wishes he didn't have. In the weeks following Miriam's funeral, Benjamin had been quietly meeting with attorneys of his own. He had been contesting the structure of the estate plan I had drawn up, specifically, the provisions that protected Laura and ring-fenced certain assets from his direct control. But more than that, he had been making inquiries, careful, methodical inquiries, into what legal options existed if a parent were deemed mentally unfit to manage their own financial affairs. He had been asking about guardianship. He had been asking about how to have a person declared incompetent. Gerald slid a document across the table toward me. It was a letter from a psychiatric clinic in Morris County, a private facility, confirming a consultation that Benjamin had arranged. A consultation at which he had presented what he described as a pattern of concerning behaviors in his elderly father, confusion erratic decision-making, emotional instability following the loss of his wife, and apparent inability to properly manage his financial affairs. He had submitted this without my knowledge, without my consent, without a single conversation with me about any supposed concern for my well-being. My son had been attempting to build a case to have me declared mentally incompetent, so that he could take control of $40 million. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time after Gerald left. The house was very quiet. The late afternoon light came through the window at an angle that lit up the dust motes in the air, and I watched them drift, and I thought about the $43 I had arrived in this country with. I thought about the mattress on the floor in Newark. I thought about the 19 hours Miriam labored to bring Benjamin into the world, and the way he had felt in my arms, and the certainty I had felt in that moment that I would do anything for him. I thought about the man I had tried to raise, and the man sitting in my house with a folder full of betrayal, and I tried to reconcile those two people. I couldn't. There are moments in a person's life when grief and fury arrive at exactly the same time, and you cannot separate one from the other. When the loss of what you thought was real and the anger at what actually is real become a single unbearable thing pressing against the inside of your chest. That was one of those moments. I was 68 years old. I had built everything from nothing. I had loved my son without condition or reservation for 35 years. And he had looked at me, grieving, aging, alone, and seen an obstacle. Not a father, an obstacle. I need to stop here for a moment. Because if this story is hitting close to home, if you know what it feels like to be betrayed by someone you gave everything to, drop a comment below and let me know. You are not alone, and this story is far from over. I did not confront Benjamin immediately. I know that might surprise you. I know the instinct. The fury of a man who has just discovered that his own son has been maneuvering to strip him of his autonomy, his assets, his dignity, would suggest a confrontation, a phone call, a face-to-face reckoning in which everything is said out loud at maximum volume. But I am 68 years old. I did not build $40 million from 43 by acting on instinct. I built it by watching, by being patient, by understanding that the most dangerous thing you can do when someone is moving against you is let them know you've seen the movement. So I waited, and I watched, and I began, very quietly, to prepare. The first call I made the morning after Gerald's visit was to a different attorney, a litigation specialist named Patricia Okafor, who had been recommended to me years ago by a business associate and whom I had never needed until now. Patricia was 52 years old, meticulous, and possessed of a particular quality that I have always admired and rarely found. She was not impressed by anything. Not by wealth, not by charm, not by the kind of confidence that men like Benjamin mistake for authority. She listened to everything I told her without expression, asked 6 precise questions, and then leaned back in her chair and said, "Mr. ZAHA, your son has made several significant legal miscalculations. Let's make sure he makes several more." I liked her immediately. Patricia's first piece of advice was simple: document everything. Every conversation with Benjamin, every communication, every decision he had made within the company in the past 18 months. She wanted a full picture of what he had been doing while I was grieving, while I was distracted, while he had calculated that my attention was elsewhere. What emerged over the following 2 weeks, as Patricia and her team began pulling records, was a picture that turned my stomach. In the 14 months since Miriam's diagnosis had worsened and I had begun stepping back from the day-to-day operations of the company, Benjamin had made a series of financial moves that ranged from questionable to outright corrupt. He had restructured 2 vendor contracts in ways that funneled money through a shell company, a company that Patricia traced, after 3 days of careful work, to an LLC registered in Delaware in the name of Vanessa Cole. Vanessa, the woman he had left Laura for. He had been stealing from the company to fund a life with his girlfriend. Small amounts at first, then larger ones. Over 14 months, the total came to just over $600,000. He had stolen from a company that his father had built with 40 years of labor. A company whose employees had mortgages and children and retirement accounts that depended on its financial health. He had looked at everything I had created and decided it was a resource to be mined rather than a legacy to be protected. And simultaneously, he had been building his case to have me declared incompetent, to seize legal control of my finances, to ensure that by the time anyone noticed the discrepancies, he would be in a position to manage the narrative. I thought I knew the depths a person could sink to when money was involved. I had been in business for 40 years. I had seen greed, deception, broken agreements, betrayals of every professional variety. But this was my son. This was the boy I had carried on my shoulders at the Jersey Shore when he was 4 years old, shrieking with joy at the waves. This was the boy I had driven to the emergency room at 2 in the morning when he was 12 and had broken his arm falling out of a tree, holding his hand in the waiting room while he tried not to cry because he was trying to be brave. This was the boy I had stood beside at his wedding and wept openly because I was so full of happiness that my body didn't know what else to do with it. That boy and this man existed in the same body, shared the same face, carried the same name. I still cannot entirely explain how that is possible. Laura, meanwhile, had begun to piece things together from her own direction. Living in my apartment, she had started going through the financial records she had access to from their joint accounts that Benjamin had not yet fully managed to close her out of, and she was finding things that disturbed her. Charges on joint cards for hotel rooms, restaurants, jewelry. Withdrawals that didn't match any household expense she could account for. The financial portrait of a double life, rendered in transaction histories. She brought the records to me one evening, spread out on my kitchen table in neat, organized piles, because Laura was precise in everything she did, even in the act of uncovering her husband's betrayal. She sat across from me and walked me through each item calmly, methodically, only her hands betraying her, pressed flat on the table, pressed so hard that her fingertips were white. "How long?" she asked at one point, not looking up from the papers. "The records go back 14 months, I said carefully. She absorbed that. She nodded slowly, the way a person nods when they are confirming something they already suspected but had been hoping, against all evidence, was wrong. "I kept thinking," she said quietly, "that I was doing something wrong, that I was missing something, that if I just tried harder." She stopped, shook her head. "I worked extra shifts last year so we could save more. I thought we needed to be more financially careful. He told me the company was going through a difficult period." She laughed, a short, painful sound. "I believed him, Laura," I said. "I believed him," she said again, and this time it wasn't a statement of naivety. It was an indictment. Of him, not of herself. "This is not your fault," I said. "None of this is your fault." She looked up at me then, and her eyes were dry. She had moved past the stage of tears for Benjamin, I think, into something harder and steadier. "I know that," she said. "I just needed to say it out loud." It was around this time that Benjamin made his first direct move against me. I received a call from a Dr. Raymond Holt, a psychiatrist affiliated with the Morris County Clinic that had appeared in Gerald's documents. Dr. Holt was professionally courteous, carefully neutral, and explained that he had been contacted by a family member. He did not use Benjamin's name, but he did not need to, who had expressed concern about my mental state following the loss of my wife. He said he would like to schedule an evaluation, entirely voluntary, just to ensure I was coping well. I told Dr. Holt, with equal professionalism and considerably more ice, that I was coping perfectly well, that I was in communication with my own physicians, and that if he received any further requests to evaluate me, he should know that my attorney would be very interested in the full documentation of those requests. There was a pause on the line. "Mr. ZAHA," Dr. Holt said, and his tone had shifted slightly, less clinical, more careful. "I want you to know that I had significant reservations about this consultation from the beginning. What was presented to me did not, in my professional assessment, constitute sufficient grounds for any formal proceeding." "I appreciate your candor," I said. "I thought you should know," he said simply. After I hung up, I sat for a moment with the phone in my hand. Even Benjamin's psychiatrist had seen through the plan. The case he was building was thinner than he believed. His confidence, that lifelong, unearned confidence, was going to be his undoing. But there was one more thing I had to navigate, and it was the hardest thing of all. I had to see my son. Benjamin called me in the 3rd week of June, casual as a Sunday morning, and suggested we have lunch. He wanted to discuss the company, he said, some restructuring ideas he had been thinking about. He thought it would be good for us to reconnect after the difficult months of Miriam's passing. He said Miriam's passing, like it was weather, like it was a season. I agreed to lunch. I chose the restaurant, a quiet Italian place in Westfield where I had eaten for years, where the owner knew me and the corner table was always available if I called ahead. I arrived first, ordered water, and sat with my hands folded on the table and my face composed into the expression of an old man who was tired and grieving and perhaps a little confused by the pace of change around him. I had discussed this with Patricia. She called it managing the narrative. I called it giving my son enough rope. Benjamin arrived 12 minutes late, which was new. He had always been punctual, and tardiness, I had learned from Patricia, was one of the small behavioral shifts that accompanied a person who had begun to believe they operated above ordinary social expectations. He was dressed expensively and looked well, tanned, recently groomed, wearing a watch I did not recognize and had certainly not given him. He hugged me with the practiced warmth of a man performing affection for an audience, and sat down and ordered $100 bottle of wine without looking at the menu. "Dad," he said, pouring my glass before I could decline it, "you look tired. Are you sleeping okay?" "I'm sleeping fine," I said. "You should think about seeing someone," he said. "After everything with Mom, it's a lot for one person to carry alone. There's no shame in talking to a professional." He said it with such seamless, convincing concern that for a fraction of a second, just a fraction, I felt the doubt he was engineering in me. The question that he wanted planted. Am I okay? Am I coping? Is my grief making me unreliable? I understood in that moment exactly how it would have worked on a more isolated, less prepared version of me. The gentle, repeated suggestion that I was struggling. The calls to psychiatrists. The documented concerns. Building a case stone by stone while his target sat across from him eating pasta and feeling cared for. I looked at my son across the table, this handsome, well-dressed, financially comfortable man who had my jaw and his mother's eyes, and not one single trace of the values I had spent a lifetime trying to pass down to him. And I felt something settle in me. Not peace, not yet, but resolution. I was not going to let him win, and I was not going to become him in the process of stopping him. Those two things, held together, were going to be the hardest balance I had ever tried to maintain. If you're still with me right now, and I know this is a lot, drop your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever had to stay calm when everything in you wanted to explode? Tell me about it, because what comes next changed everything. End of Act 3, proceeding to Act 4, the climax. Act 4, the reckoning. 2,000 words. Patricia Okafor had a phrase she used when we reached the point of action. She called it opening the envelope. "Mr. ZAHA," she told me one morning in her office, the city of Newark spread out in gray-blue morning light behind her window. "At some point in every case like this, you stop gathering and you start presenting. You open the envelope. And when you do it completely. No warnings. No half measures. Everything, all at once." We opened the envelope on a Thursday morning in July. The setting was a formal meeting, a board meeting of ZAHA Properties and Construction Incorporated, the company that bore my name. I had called it under my authority as majority shareholder and founder, citing a need to review recent financial decisions. Benjamin was present, seated at the long conference table in our Westfield office with two of his own advisors beside him, men I recognized as having been recently added to the company's legal counsel. Additions I now understood were Benjamin's own installations. Also present, Patricia Okafor and her associate, Gerald Morse. Our company's long-tenured CFO, David Park, who had been with me for 16 years and whose expression as he took his seat told me everything I needed to know about where his loyalty resided. And two representatives from the forensic accounting firm Patricia had engaged. Benjamin looked around the table when he entered, and I watched him do the quick calculation that sharp people do, reading the room, assessing the configuration, trying to determine the shape of what he was walking into. For just a moment, something moved behind his eyes. Not quite recognition. Almost. He sat down. He adjusted his jacket. He smiled at me across the table. "Dad," he said, "what's all this?" "A board meeting," I said, as I indicated in the notice. "Right. But," he gestured at the unfamiliar faces. "Who are all these people?" "People I trust," I said simply. "Shall we begin?" Patricia handled the presentation with the calm efficiency of a person who has done this before and has no interest in theater. She laid out the financial discrepancies first, the vendor contract restructuring, the shell company in Delaware, the $600,000 that had moved through it over 14 months. She placed printed documentation in front of every person at the table, including Benjamin, who watched the pages slide in front of him with an expression that was working very hard to remain neutral. His advisor leaned toward him and murmured something. Benjamin held up one hand slightly, a small gesture, almost imperceptible, to stop him. Then Patricia presented the documentation around the competency inquiry, the consultation at Morris County, the communication with Dr. Holt, the legal research Benjamin had commissioned into guardianship proceedings. She laid it all out cleanly, without commentary, without drama, in the same neutral tone she might use to read a grocery list. The room was absolutely silent. I watched my son. There is something that happens to a person's face when a plan they believed was invisible is suddenly visible to everyone in the room. It is not a single expression. It is a series of very fast, very small adjustments, as the face tries to find a configuration that communicates innocence, or confusion, or righteous indignation. Benjamin tried all three in the space of about 4 seconds. None of them landed. "This is," he started. "The forensic accounting firm's full report is in the folder in front of you," Patricia said, as though he hadn't spoken. "I'd also direct your attention to tab C, which contains communications subpoenaed from the Delaware LLC's registered agent, and tab E, which is Dr. Holt's written statement confirming the nature of the consultation your client initiated." "My client," Benjamin said, and something shifted in his voice, the smoothness cracking, the performance slipping. He looked at me. "Dad, these people work for you. Whatever they've told you." "Benjamin." My voice was quiet. It had always been quiet when things were serious. Miriam used to say that the lower my voice dropped, the more I meant what I was saying. "Stop." He stopped. The room waited. I had been thinking about this moment for weeks. I had rehearsed versions of it in my head at 3 in the morning, standing in the kitchen in the dark, running through what I would say and how I would say it. I had considered fury. I had considered the cold, formal language of legal proceedings. I had considered all the different shapes that righteous anger could take. But sitting here now, looking at my son, and he was still my son, regardless of what he had done, regardless of what he had tried to do. That was the truth I kept being unable to escape. I found that what I wanted to say was none of those rehearsed things. "Do you remember," I said, "when you were 7 years old and you broke the neighbor's window with a baseball?" He blinked. Whatever he had expected, it was not this. "You came home, and you went straight to your room. Didn't say a word. And I could see something was wrong, but I waited. I waited all through dinner, all through the evening, and at 9 o'clock at night, you came downstairs in your pajamas, and you stood in the kitchen doorway, and you said, 'Dad, I did something wrong, and I'm sorry.'" I paused. "Do you remember what I said?" His jaw was tight. "Dad," I said, "thank you for telling me. And then we talked about how to fix it. We went to the neighbor together the next morning. You apologized. You offered to do yard work to pay for the window. And when it was over, we got ice cream." I looked at him steadily. "I have never needed you to be perfect, Benjamin. I have never expected you to be someone who doesn't make mistakes. I have only ever needed you to be honest with me. That was the only thing I truly required." He was very still. "You stole from this company," I said. "You stole from the people who work here, from the legacy your mother and I spent 40 years building. You tried to have me declared incompetent so you could take control of assets that I worked my entire life for. You threw Laura, one of the finest people I have ever known, out of her own home while she was at work in garbage bags." My voice remained quiet. It did not waver. "And you did all of it not because you needed to, not because you were desperate or suffering, but because you wanted more than what you were already being given. Because the $40 million you were already going to inherit wasn't enough for you to wait for." Something was happening to his face. The performance was entirely gone now. What was left underneath it was something younger, something rawer, a kind of exposure that I recognized, because I had seen it on his face when he was 7 years old in pajamas in a kitchen doorway. "Patricia," I said, "please explain to my son the legal position he is currently in." Patricia laid it out with characteristic precision. The financial fraud exposed by the forensic accounting was sufficient for criminal charges: wire fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, potentially embezzlement. The competency preceding attempt, now documented and on record, would constitute grounds for a separate civil action. His position as company co-director was, effective this meeting, suspended pending a full internal audit. His advisors were very quiet. However, Patricia continued, and she glanced at me briefly before proceeding. "Mr. ZAHA has indicated that his preference, at this time, is not to pursue criminal prosecution." Benjamin looked at me. "I don't want to put my son in prison," I said. It was the simplest sentence I had ever spoken, and it cost me more than I can describe to say it, because it was entirely true, despite everything. Because whatever he had become, whatever he had done, he was still the boy I had carried on my shoulders at the Jersey Shore. He was still the boy Miriam had labored 19 hours to bring into the world. That did not excuse what he had done. It did not minimize it. But it was real, and I was not going to pretend it wasn't. "What I want," I said, "is for you to sit here, in this room, and hear everything. All of it. And then I want you to make a choice." The choice I offered him was structured by Patricia, but shaped by me. The $600,000 was to be repaid to the company in full through a structured arrangement. His role in the company was to be formally restructured with oversight mechanisms that would remain in place for a period of no less than 3 years. The divorce proceedings with Laura were to be conducted fairly, with full financial disclosure. No hiding of assets, no legal maneuvering designed to leave her with nothing, no leveraging of his position to bully her into an inadequate settlement. And the competency proceedings, every document, every communication, every record, was to be formally withdrawn and sealed. In exchange, I would not pursue criminal charges. I would not go to the press. And I would not remove him from the company entirely, because despite everything, I was not ready to give up on the possibility, however fragile, that somewhere inside the man sitting across from me was still the son I had raised. Benjamin sat with all of this for a long time. His advisors murmured. He waved them quiet again. He looked at me, and I looked back at him, and in the silence between us was 35 years of a relationship that had been built slowly and carefully, and with enormous love, and had been nearly destroyed in 14 months of greed. "I need time," he said finally. "You have until Monday," Patricia said. He looked at his hands on the table. Then he looked at me again. And for just a moment, just a brief, unguarded moment, he looked exactly like a 7-year-old boy in pajamas in a kitchen doorway, holding the weight of something wrong that he didn't know how to put down. "Dad," he said. His voice was different. All the smoothness gone. He stopped. I waited. "I don't know how I got here," he said. It was barely above a whisper. It was the most honest thing he had said to me in a year. "I know," I said. "That's why I'm still sitting at this table. This is the moment that everything hung on, and I want to hear from you. Have you ever given someone a second chance when every logical part of you said not to? Comment below. Because the ending of this story is going to show you exactly what that decision cost me, and what it gave back." Benjamin called me on Sunday evening. Not Monday. Sunday. 18 hours before his deadline, at 7:43 in the evening, while I was sitting on the back porch of my house in the fading late summer light, watching the garden that Miriam had planted and tended for 20 years slowly going to seed in her absence. I had been meaning to hire someone to care for it. I hadn't been able to bring myself to do it yet. There was something about watching it grow wild that felt like honesty, like the right acknowledgement of what had been lost. I answered on the second ring. "Dad." His voice was raw in a way I hadn't heard since he was a teenager. The polished surface entirely gone, sanded down to something underneath that was real and exposed and afraid. "Can I come over?" I looked at the garden. "Come over," I said. He arrived 40 minutes later. He was not wearing the expensive clothes he had worn to the board meeting. He was in jeans and a plain dark shirt, and he looked like he hadn't slept in days, which I suspected was true. He stood on the back porch with his hands in his pockets, and he looked at his mother's garden for a long moment before he looked at me. "She loved this garden," he said. "She did." He sat down in the chair across from me, the same chair he had sat in since he was a child, the worn one with the faded cushion that Miriam had always threatened to replace, and never had. He sat in it and leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, and he stared at the garden, and after a long time he began to talk. He talked for almost 2 hours. He told me about the pressure he had felt when I began stepping back from the company, the weight of expectation, the terror of inadequacy, the private conviction that he had never truly earned what he had been given, and that one day everyone would realize it. He told me about meeting Vanessa, who had made him feel, for a while, like a different version of himself, a version that wasn't afraid. He told me how the small financial manipulations had begun almost casually, almost as a test. Could he do it without anyone noticing? And when no one noticed, the test became a habit, and the habit became a system. He told me about the moment he had first consulted the attorney about competency proceedings, and how he had told himself it was protective, that he was looking out for me, and how he had known even as he told himself that it was a lie. He told me about Laura. He told me about the moment he had packed her things into garbage bags, and how afterward he had sat in the empty house for 3 hours without being able to move, because some part of him, some part that he had been working very hard to suffocate, knew exactly what he was doing and who he was becoming. I told myself she'd be fine, he said. She's strong. She has a job. She'd be fine. I was just telling myself whatever I needed to so I could keep going. That's what people do, I said quietly, when they've decided what they want and they need to get past their conscience to get it. He flinched. I know. There was a long silence. Crickets in the garden. The last light fading from the sky. I think I became someone I don't want to be, he said. And I think I've been becoming him for a long time. And I kept waiting for someone to stop me, and no one did. And I kept going. He looked at me. I think I thought you'd stop me. I felt that land in my chest. I turned it over carefully, the way you turn something fragile, something that could break if you're not attentive. I'm not your conscience, Benjamin, I said. I couldn't be even when you were a child, and I certainly can't be now. A man's choices are his own. But I'll tell you something. I paused. The fact that you're sitting here right now, tonight, before your deadline, without your advisors and without your armor, that tells me that your conscience is still working. It's buried under a lot of rubble, but it's still in there. He rubbed his face with both hands. He looked, in that moment, young and exhausted and lost in the way that people look when they have finally put down something very heavy that they have been carrying for too long. What do I do? He said. Not to Patricia, not to attorneys or advisors or anyone with a structured plan. To me, his father. You start by talking to Laura, I said. He looked up. Not about the divorce, I said. Not about settlements or attorneys or financial disclosures. You call her and you ask her if you can speak to her face to face, and when she agrees. If she agrees, you sit across from her and you tell her the truth. All of it. Not because it will save your marriage, because I don't know if anything can save your marriage, and that is a consequence you have to accept. But because she deserves the truth, and because you will not be able to build anything real, any life, any version of yourself worth living in, on the foundation of what you've done to her without first acknowledging it to her face. He was quiet. And then, I said, you come back to this company. Not as my heir, not as a director with unchecked authority, but as someone who is going to earn his place from the ground up. The same way I did. Because you have the capacity, Benjamin. I have always known that. What you have never developed is the character to match it. You'd still want me in the company? He said. He sounded genuinely bewildered. After everything. You're my son, I said. It was not a complicated statement. It contained everything. I am furious with you. I am heartbroken by what you did. I will be carrying the weight of this for a long time, and so will you. But you are my son, and I am not going to throw away everything that is real and good about you because of everything that went wrong. I looked at him steadily. What I need from you is the same thing I needed when you were 7 years old standing in that doorway. I need you to be honest. I need you to face what you've done, and I need you to do the work to become better than this. He looked at his mother's garden. Mom would have hated what I did, he said softly. Yes, I agreed. She would have been devastated. Would she have forgiven me? I thought about Miriam. About the woman who had loved him for 35 years with a ferocity and a grace that I had spent my whole marriage trying to be worthy of. Who had sat beside me in the hospital at 2 a.m. when he broke his arm and held his other hand. Who had danced with him at his wedding with her head thrown back in pure joy. Who had, in her final lucid months, asked me repeatedly if Benjamin was happy, if he was okay, worrying about him even as she faded. She already has, I said. That's who your mother was. He cried then, quietly, without drama, the way a man cries when he has finally stopped fighting something that needed to be faced. He sat in the worn chair in the garden his mother had planted, in the falling dark, and he cried, and I sat across from him and let him, because some grief needs to be witnessed and not fixed. After a while, he wiped his face and sat up straight. I'll call Laura tomorrow, he said. Good. I'll sign Patricia's agreement. All of it. I know. He looked at me. Dad, I'm sorry. I know that doesn't. I know it doesn't come close to covering it. But I am. I'm genuinely sorry. I know you are, I said. Now show me. What followed was not a movie reconciliation. It was not a sudden, seamless restoration of everything that had been broken. Life does not work that way. and I would not insult you by pretending it does. Benjamin called Laura. She did not answer the first time, or the second. On the third attempt, she picked up. She listened to what he said. She agreed to meet. I was not there for that conversation. I do not know everything that was said. What I know is that Laura has told me since that he told her the truth, all of it, and that he apologized without excuse and without qualification. Whether that was enough, whether it changed anything between them as two people whose marriage had been broken by a year of betrayal, was something only they could determine. What I can tell you is this. The divorce proceedings were conducted without hostility. Laura received a fair settlement, more than fair, in fact, because Benjamin insisted on it. He told his attorney that he wanted her properly taken care of, and his attorney, who had clearly been uncertain about his client's character, visibly relaxed when he said it. Laura did not take Benjamin back. I want to be honest about that. Some things, once broken, do not reassemble in the same shape. But she took something else from that final conversation, a kind of closure, a kind of release from the self-doubt that his betrayal had planted in her. She texted me the night after their meeting, just 3 words. I'm okay, Dad. She still calls me that. She always will. Vanessa, as it turned out, had known about the financial arrangements, had benefited directly from them. In fact, when the full picture of the Delaware LLC became clear, she retained her own attorney and attempted to distance herself from Benjamin with remarkable speed. Benjamin, to his credit, did not seem particularly surprised. I think, on some level, he had already known who she was. He simply hadn't wanted to know it while he was in the middle of wanting her. The company survived the audit. The $600,000 gap was filled through the repayment structure Patricia had designed, and David Park, steady, unflappable David Park, who had been with me for 16 years, managed the process with his characteristic precision. The employees never knew the full extent of what had happened, and I preferred it that way. They had families and mortgages and futures that did not need to be destabilized by the drama of a founder's son's choices. Benjamin came back to work in September, not as co-director, as a project manager on a mid-size residential development in Essex County, a role he had last held, in a more junior capacity, 8 years ago. I watched him show up on the first day in work boots and a hard hat, and I felt something complicated and stubborn and irreducible move through my chest. Hope. Despite everything. Still, hopelessly hope. He worked hard. He always had, in the moments when he chose to. Over the months that followed, I watched him slowly, carefully, begin to rebuild. Not the version of himself that had sat across from me at that board meeting, polished and strategic and hollowed out, but something older and more real. Something that looked, occasionally and unexpectedly, like the boy in the kitchen doorway. We had dinner together every Sunday. At first it was stilted, careful, loaded with all the things unsaid. Gradually, it became easier. Not the same as before. We were both different now, both shaped by what had happened in ways that couldn't be undone. But something honest. Something that knew its own fractures and chose to hold together anyway. One Sunday evening in late November, we were sitting at the kitchen table after dinner. The kitchen table where I had sat with Gerald's folder, the same table where Laura had spread her financial records with her hands pressed white against the wood, and Benjamin picked up a photograph that was sitting on the counter. It was a photo of Miriam and me taken at his wedding, both of us caught mid-laugh, unaware of the camera. He held it for a long time without speaking. I keep thinking, he said finally, about what she would think of all this. I've thought about that too, I said. I think she'd be disappointed in what I did. He paused. And I think she'd refuse to give up on me anyway. That would have annoyed me before. He set the photo back down, carefully. Now it makes me want to be someone she didn't have to work that hard to believe in. I looked at my son, at the jaw that was mine and the eyes that were his mother's and the hands that were still learning what it meant to build rather than take. Then be that person, I said. That's all. Just be that person. Outside, the November wind moved through Miriam's garden, still wild, still unruly, but alive. Still alive. I had decided, finally, not to hire anyone to tame it. I had decided to let it grow the way it wanted to grow, shape itself the way it needed to, find its own form in the absence of the hands that had tended it. Some things, I had learned, need to be given the space to become what they are, even if what they become is different from what you imagined. Even if the growing is slow and complicated and requires more patience than you thought you had. I am 68 years old. I have $43 in my memory and 40 million in my name, and a garden that is finding its own way forward, and a son who is doing the same, and the photograph of a woman on my kitchen counter who labored 19 hours to bring him into the world and loved him without condition for every year she was alive. I am not done being angry. I am not done grieving. And I am not done, not by a long way, believing that the people we love are capable of becoming better than their worst moments. That is not naivety. That is the most expensive thing I own. If you made it to the end of this story, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below. Have you ever had to choose between protecting yourself and refusing to give up on someone you loved? Have you ever watched someone you raised break your heart and found the capacity to hold the door open anyway? This story is about betrayal, yes. But more than that, it's about what we choose to do with the people we cannot stop loving, even when they've given us every reason to. Tell me your thoughts. I read every single one. Thank you so much for watching my story all the way to the end. Your support means everything. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts.